With hindsight, it's easy to persuade ourselves that we would all have been anti-appeasers. We'd all have perceived with clarity the nature of the international European civil war that seemed to be emerging in the late 1930s, with the intervention of the Russians on one side and the fascists of Italy and Germany on the other, making Spain after 1936 a particular battleground of that conflict. And certainly you can find people in Britain who contributed to the aids of Spain. Picasso's painting of Guernica was exhibited in London to great acclaim. But only 2,300 volunteers went from Britain and Ireland and the Commonwealth to go and fight with the international brigades and confront the rising menace of fascism. For most people, it seems the policy of appeasement and of benign non-intervention in Spain, whilst turning a blind eye to assisting Franco, was that was pursued by the conservative-dominated national governments of the 1930s, was a much more popular option. Again, with hindsight, this policy has come to be criticised, not least as a result of the writing subsequently. Some historians have suggested that the popularity of this policy has been based upon the successful manipulation of the press and the media by the government at the time, hence the book by Richard Cockett on the slide here. Not just in terms of the press, but also in terms of the newsreel cameras who, when Chamberlain came back to Heston Airport with his piece of paper from Munich, had all the best slots round the airport to take the pictures, which were beamed across the world. And here he is in the middle of our slide. So, appeasement, on the face of it, seems to have been a reasonably popular policy pursued by a government which had a massive majority and was returned with a majority of 250 in the election of October 1935. It could be argued that appeasement, in the sense of trying to come up with some overarching and all-encompassing solution for international problems, was a central tenet of British foreign policy throughout the interwar years. Indeed, the whole notion of creating a League of Nations as a forum for resolving these crises could be seen as such a body. And certainly in Britain in the 1920s, the League of Nations Union had a mass membership, it had corporate membership from large numbers of civil society bodies such as churches. It was a popular and widespread form of support for peace. Indeed, support for peace could be fairly widespread throughout the population in the 1920s. There was an optimism that war could be avoided. This was built into policy in 1919 by the then Lloyd George coalition government in the form of the 10-year rule. This established the assumption that there will be no major conflict involving Britain for at least 10 years. Winston Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer at the end of the 1920s, made the 10-year rule a rolling one. It's only as Britain moved into what the poet W.H. Auden described as the low, dishonest decade of the 1930s that the 10-year rule came into question. It was dropped in 1933, not long after Hitler had come to power, on the recommendation of the Chiefs of Staff. At the time, the national government itself, had a cabinet committee on disarmament. Nonetheless, the following year, rearmament started with the focus initially very much on the Royal Air Force. This reflects one of the characteristic aspects of British thinking about the likely conflict that we would next see. Stanley Baldwin, the leader of the Conservative Party and the second most important man in the national government, had said in November 1932, the bomber will always get through. The notion of the risk of bombing and the mass casualties that it might lead to was indeed one of the things which concentrated British minds, and it was at the time widely alleged that this was a factor in Labour winning the supposedly safe Tory seat of East Fulham in October 1933. The Labour candidate, John Wilmot, stood on essentially a pacifist ticket, although ironically, some years later, he was to be responsible in part for the development of the atomic bomb in the period of Clem Attlee's government after the war. So the 1930s mark a very different kind of setting. In the 1920s, it's possible to think that powers can negotiate amongst themselves amicable solutions to international problems. So Neville Chamberlain's half-brother, Austin Chamberlain, as Foreign Secretary, is a moving spirit behind the Treaty of Locarno in 1925, which regularizes Germany's western borders, but significantly not its eastern ones. The 1930s mark a shift from that moment of optimism and mark a forward policy by three powers who felt dissatisfied in various ways in the aftermath of the settlement of the First World War. Japan and Italy had been on the Allied side in that war, but Japan in 1931 begins an aggressive policy which leads to them occupying Manchuria and fighting both with the Chinese and indeed the Russians in the late 1930s. In 1935, not long after the League of Nations Union publishes the results of the peace ballot, the Italians move from being on side with the British and the French in confronting the Germans. So when Hitler first menaces Austria, Mussolini moves his troops to the border with Austria. After the Abyssinian crisis of 1935, however, it becomes harder, well, it becomes impossible, in fact, as the British find out, though not for want of trying, to get the Italians back on side. Effectively, the Italians move over to being part of the Axis with Germany and eventually Japan. And it's Germany which is also moving in more aggressive directions, not least in reoccupying militarily the Rhineland in the crisis of 1936, in despite of the pledges made at Versailles. Appeasement, if you like, becomes very clear at this point in the mid-1930s, when the British are choosing not to respond aggressively to German attempts to revise the peace settlement at the end of the First World War. Instead, they try to buy off the Germans, so the naval treaty with Germany in 1935, which allows a certain degree of German naval rearmament, is agreed. And then, with the Rhineland crisis, you get the British, and in consequence the French, not responding to this act of aggression by Hitler. French intervention to oppose the German remilitarization of the Rhineland was stymied by the financial crisis that was then engulfing them, and it was more or less unthinkable in the absence of British willingness to provide them material support. And the British were unwilling to do so on several grounds. The War Secretary and future Ambassador to France, Alfred Duff Cooper, told the then German Ambassador to London that the British would fight for France if the Germans invaded French territory, but they would not oppose the occupation of the Rhineland. In his view, the British public did not care two hoots about the Germans reoccupying their own territory. Indeed, this seems to have been a reasonably good reading of British public opinion. In the 1920s, the British public had become accustomed to thinking of the Versailles Treaty as an unfair settlement, something which imposed a punitive peace upon the Germans, a view which was presented by luminaries such as John Maynard Keynes and taken up in the press. In these circumstances, Stanley Baldwin, who the previous year in 1935 had succeeded Ramsay MacDonald as Prime Minister, took the view that there were no circumstances in which the public at the time would support war over the Rhineland. And in this he seems to have been largely correct. There's certainly no evidence of public disquiet or rallies calling for intervention. Instead, there are several peace rallies to try and draw to the government's attention the fact that intervention would be unpopular. And intervention would be unpopular not just in terms of British domestic opinion, but also in terms of opinion elsewhere in the empire. It's important to bear in mind that British policymakers at the time had to take into consideration opinion not just in London and Leeds and Liverpool and Leith, but also in Ottawa, in Canberra, in Auckland, in Pretoria, even perhaps to some extent in Delhi, given the risk of risings in India and the difficulties that the British had in managing India during the Second World War. These difficulties also applied in places like South Africa, where in the late 1930s you had a Boer nationalist government, not necessarily willing to join in an imperial war in support of Britain. You had a somewhat difficult Liberal government in Canada under Mackenzie King, who quite deliberately waited an extra week in 1939 before joining Britain in declaring war on Germany. And all of these countries had to remain on side as far as the British were concerned. So managing opinion in these countries, ensuring that positive representation of the drift towards war was conveyed in newsreels, shown in Canadian, Australian, South African cinemas, etc., was part of the British strategic problem that they confronted. And they needed these countries because of considerations like how do you keep the sea lanes open and Canadian wheat coming into Britain if you don't keep the Canadians on side. But all the dominions have their own domestic concerns. The Australians and the New Zealanders, for instance, are, for obvious reasons, rather more concerned about the Japanese than they are about the Germans. Which brings us to the point of this map. When you look at the British Empire in the 1930s, the first thing that strikes you, as indeed it struck many school children at the time, might be how big it is and how extensive it is and how this is an empire on which the sun never sets. But the thing which arguably ought to strike you is how scattered it is, how stretched out it is, how vulnerable it is. Unlike the consolidated empires of Germany and America, Britain's is an empire which has massive supply chain problems, massive issues in terms of logistics, and it's essentially strung out and held together by a Royal Navy which in the late 1930s is increasingly facing overstretch, particularly if you're going to be confronting enemies in the Far East in Japan, in the Mediterranean in the shape of Italy, and in the North Sea in the shape of the Germans. The key takeaway from this slide is not British strength, but British weakness. Baldwin apparently used to say that he'd asked the railway porter at his home in Worcestershire to get a sense of what the public thought. That's not necessarily the most effective way of doing it, but it is a way of consulting, if not the man on the Clapham omnibus, the man on the Bewdley station platform. And I suppose in some ways that's really how testing public opinion operated in the 1930s. Opinion polls only came in 1937. They were followed in 1938 by an organisation called Mass Observation, which becomes quite important as a way of observing how people responded to the war during its course, but is not necessarily a very good way of capturing what people thought before the war. So what else have we got? Well, as we saw on the previous slide, you can have political rallies or the absence of them. So we know that people were still very much rallying for peace in the late 1930s, and there's not much evidence of people holding mass rallies for opposing appeasement, even among those groups who opposed the government. So the Labour Party, for instance, is not holding mass rallies in order to criticise the policy of appeasement. Another way in which you can map opinion, albeit a somewhat ineffective one, is by looking at newspapers. Newspapers as business organisations which depend upon people buying their product tend to have an image of what the reader actually wants to read, particularly if you're looking at a national market, which is what Britain was in that time, segmented along class and opinion lines. So if you're finding that the majority of the press support appeasement, as indeed they do, and so do other media outlets, such as newsreel companies, then that tends to suggest that these organs, which rest upon public opinion, suspect that opinion is broadly in favour of appeasement. That holds true even for the Daily Mirror, which in the 1930s was rapidly becoming the largest selling newspaper and moving in the direction of the Labour Party. It holds largely true for most of the decade of the Labour Party's own in-house newspaper, if you like, of the Daily Herald. And then there are some other ways in which we can test opinion. We can look at what the literature of the decade represented. And there again, you don't have lots of authors and literati writing extensive critiques of the policy of appeasement. Indeed, some of the characteristic cultural products of the period are things like Alexander Korda's film Things to Come, based on H.G. Wells's book The Shape of Things to Come, published in 1933. This envisages an air war which starts in 1940 and lasts until the 1960s. It's an important science fiction film, so it's important as a staging post in the history of cinema. Whether it represents or whether it can be taken to represent also the anxieties of the British public about the bomber will always get through, and therefore we ought to avoid war, we ought to support appeasement, is slightly more difficult to say. It was the 9th most popular British film in 1936, which doesn't exactly suggest it was the most representative or powerful cultural symbol of the decade. Probably a better way of getting a sense of what people thought is to look at two other forms of activity. One is by looking at activists within the parties. So what did activists in constituency Labour parties or constituency Conservative associations get up to? Did the latter, for instance, support the relatively small group of anti-appeasing MPs gathered around Churchill in the late 1930s? We're talking about 20 to 30 MPs, that's less than 10% of the parliamentary party. And the answer is broadly no. Anti-appeasing Tory MPs could be threatened with deselection by their constituency associations unless they were, like Harold Macmillan in Stockton, also the people who essentially bankrolled their local association. So the level of those peculiar people interested enough in politics to get committed to it at a party political level, you don't see a pushback against appeasement by and large. Instead, the vast majority of Conservative activists are clearly in support of the policy of the government. In the Labour Party, the position is more mixed, both at the parliamentary party level and at the local constituency party level. What you have is a degree of opposition to appeasement, but not necessarily a clear view of what the alternative is. Labour opposes the war estimates, opposes Munich and regards it as a casus belli. But how can you oppose the war estimates and at the same time be more in favour of war, and at the same time be suspicious of the stance that the government is taking to prepare for war on a whole series of levels? Labour, in other words, in the 1930s is internally divided, with a reasonably large pacifist minority, including not least George Lansbury, the leader of the party from 1932 to the summer of 1935, all of which makes coming up with a clear alternative policy to the national government difficult. The other way in which we might map public opinion on this subject in the 1930s is by looking at elections and at the plethora of by-elections which take place between the autumn of 1935, general election won overwhelmingly by the national government, and the outbreak of war in September 1939. A run of by-elections in which the Conservatives steadily lose ground, though whether that can be taken to mean that there is also steady and growing anti-appeasement opinion amongst the electorate is of course a more difficult question. People vote in by-elections on a number of different issues. So perhaps a better measure of public opinion on the question of appeasement or war is the peace ballot held by the League of Nations Union. This was launched in 1934 with people canvassing opinion going from door to door. It was reported on the 27th of June 1935, by which time 11.6 million people had voted. We don't know whether the people who voted were also people on the electoral register, but it does give us a reasonable representation of opinion. At the time it was published, and indeed for some time afterwards, what struck people and commentators was the answers to the opening questions. Are you in favour of all-round reduction of armaments by international agreement? Overwhelmingly, yes. Well, even the national government at this time set up a royal commission on the idea that private ownership of the arms trade should be looked into. They decided against. Are you in favour of all-round abolition of national military and naval aircraft by international agreement? This was one of the sticking points in the International Peace Conference chaired by the former Labour Foreign Secretary Arthur Henderson between 1932 and 1934, not least because the British, who had found the use of military aircraft a good and cheap way of policing imperial frontiers in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, were hugely opposed to going along with this abolition. However, what we see here is the public were in favour. On the fourth question, you also see that the public were in favour of getting rid of the manufacture and sale of armaments for private profit, although the Royal Commission set up by the national government came to a different conclusion. But the key thing, however, is the answers to the final question. Are you prepared to see a response to aggression by economic and non-military measures, such as the economic sanctions, somewhat ineffective ones, used against Italy after their attack on Abyssinia later that year? Answer overwhelmingly yes. Are you prepared also to see military measures used in face of an aggressor by a much smaller margin, but still an overwhelming one? The answer is also yes. The question of how you see the balance of policy between using sanctions and ultimately using the sanction of meeting violence with violence, which is posed by these two questions, was one which was going to shift in the ensuing 4 years. Politically, the man who dominated those 4 years was Neville Chamberlain, first as Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1931 to 1937, and then as Prime Minister from 1937 to May 1940. Chamberlain had come late to politics, only entering the House in 1918 at the age of 49. He had an extensive business career before then. He was a phlegmatic character, more at home fly fishing than in the House of Commons times. His passion for angling was indeed played upon as one of the ways of suggesting he was someone who shared many interests of ordinary people. His passion in politics was social reform. He had made his name as a Minister of Health in the 1924 to 29 Conservative government. He spent much of the 1930s concerned to improve welfare policy. Indeed, his comment in private correspondence in 1937, "What a fearful bill we owe to Master Hitler, God rot him," in 1937 reflected a irritation that the government was having to spend so much money on rearmament, which could instead have been spent on social policy. A very hard-working minister, by the late 1930s, Chamberlain had largely established an ascendancy over the House of Commons, which by and large is necessary if you're going to be a successful party leader, which was combined with all too often a too visible disdain for his Labour opponents. He was also the dominant figure not only on domestic policy but on foreign affairs within the cabinet. He was the one who shaped foreign affairs and appeasement in his administration. He was the one who led the process of managing appeasement, though, be it noted, before Munich he had not previously flown in an aeroplane. Chamberlain is often depicted as someone who was fooled by Hitler at the Munich Agreement. He can certainly be criticised for his opposition to the Soviets, who he regarded in a not dissimilar light as also enemies. But the contemporary criticism contained in the David Lowe cartoon here, that the piece of paper Chamberlain brought back in his hand to Heston Airport was simply an empty promise to be good, is possibly overstated, and possibly overstates the extent to which Chamberlain can be seen as naive. He certainly hoped to avoid war. 2 days after the outbreak, he wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury saying, "How I hope to avoid this," thinking of the news of the first casualties coming in. But with that madman, meaning Hitler, it was, of course, impossible. It seems to me that Chamberlain's naivety has been grossly overstated, perhaps to some extent for political purposes. Churchill, in his obloquy to Neville Chamberlain on the 12th of November 1940 in the House of Commons, noted, "It fell to Neville Chamberlain in one of the supreme crises of the world to be contradicted by events, to be disappointed in his hopes, and to be deceived and cheated by a wicked man. But what were these hopes in which he was disappointed? What were these wishes in which he was frustrated? What was the faith that was abused? They were surely among the most noble and benevolent instincts of the human heart. The love of peace, the toil for peace, the strife for peace, the pursuit of peace, even at great peril and certainly to the utter disdain of popularity or clamour. Whatever else history may or may not say about these terrible, tremendous years, we can be sure that Neville Chamberlain acted with perfect sincerity according to his lights, and strove to the utmost of his capacity and authority, which were powerful, to save the world from the awful, devastating struggle in which we are now engaged. Here Hitler protests with frantic words and gestures that he has only desired peace. What do these ravings and outpourings count before the silence of Neville Chamberlain's tomb?" Though I wouldn't agree with all of Churchill's rhetoric, I would agree that Chamberlain was disdainful of popularity or clamour. What he did was not in order to seek popularity. However, the evidence we have is that his policies of appeasement were indeed powerful, were indeed popular. As we can see on this slide, his satisfaction ratings were good, at levels that or contemporary prime ministers could only dream of. And they only really fall dramatically once the phony war ends in April 1940. That popularity was certainly sustained at the time of Munich. Church bells rang in celebration across the kingdom. And here is the piece of paper that Chamberlain brought back from Munich. It is, as you can see, a very modest document. Well might the eminent cartoonist David Lowe have depicted it as Hitler simply and mendaciously promising to be good. But that's perhaps to misread what Chamberlain was doing with this document. What he was establishing was that the person who signed it alongside him was indeed not someone who was good, someone who was very much the epitome of bad faith. And that mattered because public opinion needed to be convinced that the fault, if war came, lay with Germany and not with Britain. And as I said earlier, that public opinion that needed to be convinced was not just in Britain. Indeed, it was not just in the Commonwealth. It was in the United States of America as well. Establishing that it is evil, bad faith that Britain is fighting against was a hugely important part of the narrative going into the Second World War, and one which continues, not least thanks to the contribution of Neville Chamberlain, to shape how we view that war. For many commentators at the time, the first real test of public opinion after Munich was the Oxford by-election the following month. The Conservative candidate was a man called Quentin Hogg, the grandson of the Quentin Hogg who founded the University of Westminster. On the other side, the Labour and Liberal candidates were persuaded to withdraw in order to support a Popular Front candidate, so-called, based upon the Popular Frontism which had won the French general election in 1936. A.D. Lindsay was the master of Balliol College and stood in that interest. It split Conservative opinion within the university. So the then secretary of the Oxford University Conservative Association was a man called Edward Heath, president of the Oxford Union shortly thereafter, who in 1970 to 74 became Conservative Prime Minister. Heath, however, in 1938 supported the master of his college, Lindsay, having already enlivened union debates by opposing the national government in an Oxford Union which had famously in 1933 voted by a majority in favour of the motion, "This House will under no circumstances fight for king or country." 5 years later, fighting for king and country was becoming a much more popular policy in the common rooms of Oxford. Arguably, however, an even more telling by-election was one held the following month in the West Country constituency of Bridgewater, where another independent progressive candidate, Vernon Bartlett, overturned a large Conservative majority to win the seat. There were a number of commentators at the time who talked about a development of a wave of revulsion after the first euphoria of Munich. And certainly in this period, we're starting to see the first signs that public opinion is shifting away from appeasement. Certainly by October 1938, the public seems to have been no more deceived by Hitler than I've been suggesting Neville Chamberlain was. When asked in October 1938, Hitler says he has no more territorial ambitions in Europe. Do you believe him? Only 7% of the public said yes, and an overwhelming 93% disagreed. Nonetheless, the following February, you can still see a broad support for Chamberlain's policies. When asked which of these views come closest to your view of Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, the public responded, 1. It is a policy that will ultimately lead to a lasting peace in Europe, 28%. 2. It will keep us out of war until we have time to rearm, 46%. Only 24% were, if you like, opposed to it, agreeing that it is bringing war nearer by whetting the appetite of the dictators. What that suggests is that down until Hitler marching into Prague in March 1939, the bulk of the public supported Chamberlain's appeasement policy. Unfortunately for Neville Chamberlain, the polemical attack on the so-called guilty men of the 1930s, those policymakers who allegedly were negligent in opposing the depredations of Hitler or preparing to confront him militarily, appeared in July 1940, not long before Chamberlain's own death. To take that and the view that it presents as a kind of starting point for how we see appeasement would, however, be, I argue, misplaced. We can't read appeasement through hindsight. We have to see it in terms of what was being done at the time. For the British public, in the late 1930s, intervention in 1936 over the Rhineland was not popular, nor was it in 1938. It's only arguably in 1939, when Hitler marches into Prague, that we see a shift in opinion, which doesn't mean that people are in favour of war, but they do support the drawing of a line in the sand, a guarantee to Poland, and the introduction of conscription in peacetime that Chamberlain then rushes through Parliament. So appeasement after that point is no longer the preferred policy either of the government nor of the public. This doesn't mean that we should exaggerate the extent to which appeasement actually ends then. Arguably, appeasement of Italy to try and keep them out of the war goes on until June 1940. Appeasement of Japan goes on until December 1941. We could also conclude that not only then is the end of appeasement exaggerated, but so were the anxieties that the British expressed throughout the 1930s about the effects of the next war, and particularly about the risks of strategic bombing. Those risks and the responsibilities on those who take what Chamberlain characterised as and indeed Churchill, as the tremendous choices of do you go for peace or war, nonetheless weighed heavily upon people in the 1930s. The difficulty of resolving those strategic challenges and taking the country with them indeed led to divisions in all of the parties, Labour, Conservative and Liberal, over which direction to go in. In the end, however, we can conclude that the poll ratings suggest that Chamberlain's government largely managed the transition from popular support for appeasement to popular support for the war reasonably effectively. Indeed, the measure of this is the extent to which there was a united population in support of the war in September 1939, and we might conclude, if Lord Halifax had succeeded in persuading the cabinet that they ought to take Hitler's olive branch in May 1940 whilst the British expeditionary force were being driven out of France at Dunkirk, if he persuaded the cabinet to take that seriously, I suspect the public themselves would not have found it a very popular move.